The afternoon Loretta Vance was told to leave the house she had lived in for 51 years. The sky over Harlan County was the flat white of old bone. She did not argue with the attorney. She did not plead with her daughter-in-law, who stood at the foot of the stairs with her arms folded, watching the whole thing with the practiced patience of a woman who had been rehearsing that posture for some time. Loretta set the folder on the hall table, pressed the single key she still carried into her coat pocket, and went upstairs to pack. She was 68 years old. She had raised 3 children in that house. She had buried her husband from the front porch. She did not need anyone to tell her where the closets were. She packed 2 bags. She was methodical about it, the way her mother had taught her to be methodical about anything requiring decisions under pressure, one category at a time, starting with what could not be replaced. The photographs first. Dale's pocket watch from the bedside table. The small leather Bible her mother had pressed into her hands the morning she married, its spine repaired twice with brown tape, the margins filled with pencil notations, dates and names, and the occasional underlined word. The quilt from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, hand-stitched by her grandmother in the winter of 1938, the wedding ring pattern faded now to something softer. She left the dishes. She left the silver. She left the curtains she had made herself in 1987 from fabric she had driven to Lexington to find, because the shade of yellow she wanted was not carried in Corbin. She came downstairs with her 2 bags and her coat, and her face arranged the way she had arranged it at Dale's funeral. Composed not because she felt composed, but because composure was the only thing left that was entirely hers, and she was not giving it away in front of her daughter-in-law. She walked out the front door and sat in the truck and looked at the house through the windshield for a long moment. The limestone foundation, the chestnut shelves through the kitchen window, the addition she and Dale had framed up one August with her brother Raymond and a borrowed nail gun. The 2 of them too young and too confident, and somehow, right anyway, the walls plumb and the corners square. She had been 37 that August. Dale had been 39. They had not known they were building something that would last 43 more years. They had just been building. Her son Marcus had called from Denver the week before. The house needed to be liquidated, he said. His word, not hers, liquidated. The estate attorneys had found a buyer, a development group out of Lexington. The offer was fair, he said. The timeline was firm. He was sorry, he said, in the tone of a man who had decided the matter was already settled and was informing her as a courtesy. She had listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your father and I built that house's addition with our own hands. It took us 2 summers." There was a pause on the line. Marcus said, "Mom, it's just a house." It was not just a house. The limestone foundation had been poured by her grandfather in 1921. She had been born in the front bedroom. Her father had built the kitchen shelving in 1961 from chestnut he had milled himself, and those shelves were still in there, solid as the day he planed them flat. The house sat on 4 acres off a county road outside Corbin, on land her family had worked since before the county had paved that road, since before the road was anything but a track between holdings. There was a root cellar under the kitchen that had been sealed since the early 1970s, the door bolted and painted over during a renovation that happened before Loretta was old enough to have asked about it. Her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 12, that the floor under that house held more than the house itself. She had asked him what he meant. He had smiled a slow smile and said, "You'll know what to do when the time comes." She had thought about that sentence perhaps 100 times in 50 years. It had no meaning she could fix to anything specific. The cellar door had been painted over. The floor stayed sealed. Life moved forward, the way floors do, steadily holding the weight placed on them. Now the house was being sold for $312,000 to people who intended to knock it down. She was given 30 days. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if someone in your family was ever left a worthless piece of property that turned out to be anything, but tell me about it below. I read every one. She found a listing in the second week. Not the main house, which was already under contract, but a parcel that adjoined it on the south side. The 4 acres her grandfather had deeded separately in 1944. the ones that had no road frontage and sat at the bottom of a clay hollow that flooded 2 springs and 3 and grew nothing useful that anybody had ever tried to plant. The development group had not wanted it. Nobody had wanted it in 30 years. It was listed with a county executor for $1 because the back taxes owed on it exceeded its assessed value, and the county wanted to clear the title. Loretta drove to the courthouse in Corbin on a Tuesday morning and paid the dollar herself. The clerk looked at her across the counter. She looked back. He stamped the deed and handed it over without comment. She put it in her coat pocket next to the key. She did not have a plan beyond that. She had the key and the dollar and the deed and a small cooler in the back of her truck and $63 to her name after the transfer fee. She drove back to the county road and turned down the gravel lane toward the parcel she had just bought, bumping over clay ruts in the November cold. And when the lane ended at a wire gate, she got out and stood in the dead grass and looked at what she owned. The hollow was mostly scrub cedar and old fence row, the kind of land that looks abandoned because it has been left to its own logic for several decades. There was a creek at the bottom that ran clean and cold, even in dry years, because it fed off a spring that Loretta had drunk from as a girl, kneeling in the mud on summer mornings before her mother called her in. At the top of the south bank, almost invisible in the cedar growth, stood the outbuilding her grandfather had called the stone house, though it was not really a house, more a single-room structure built of the same flat limestone as the main foundation, the kind of building that gets put up in a season by a man who knows what he is doing and intends for it to outlast him. She had played in it as a child, those long, loose summer afternoons when children are given the run of a property before the work claims them. The roof had been redone at some point, the tin still showing no serious rust. The chimney stood straight. She had not been inside in 40 years. She pushed through the cedar and tried the door. The latch was rusted, but it gave when she leaned into it. Inside was cold and perfectly dry, the smell of old stone and timber, and something under that, something she recognized from childhood without having a name for, the smell of a space that has been holding itself together for a long time and has not been disturbed in its doing. A wood stove sat in the corner, cast iron, a good one. A workbench ran along one wall, solid pine, peg not nailed. The old cot frame in the corner still had its legs level on the stone floor. A shelf near the door held mason jars of old air and a kerosene lantern her grandfather had left when he died in 1978, the font still half full. She sat on the workbench for a long time. Then she lit the lantern because it was getting dark and she had nowhere else to go. She had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a family, where growing up meant learning to be useful before you learn much else. Her father, Dillard Pruitt, had worked the county road crew for 30 years and kept a small tobacco allotment on the side and raised a garden that fed the family from June to February with what the jars held. Her mother, Ruth, had put up 300 jars of food every summer without making a ceremony of it, the way people do who understand that food on the shelf in November is not a virtue, but a practical matter. Loretta had absorbed the work the way children absorb language, without studying it, until one day she could do it all and understood she always had. Her brothers had both left. Bobby went to Dayton in 1962 and built a decent life there and came home at Christmas until the Christmas visits thinned and stopped. Raymond went to Lexington for construction work in 1964 and married a woman who did not care for the hollow and stayed. Her sister Jean had died of a fever in 1955 when Loretta was 9, which was the first great sorrow of the family and the one that had quieted her father in a lasting way, settling into him like a stone into a creek, changing the shape of what flowed around him without being visible on the surface. Jean's death was never discussed in the house. It was simply a shape the family moved around. Her father had turned his grief into thoroughness. That was what she understood now, in the hollow at 68, that the man who had filed those water rights and written that letter and laid those papers on that shelf had been for 35 years, converting his losses into provisions. Every document filed carefully, every resource registered, every act of deliberate preparation pointed at the same thing. The house and the ground under it would be there for Loretta when she needed them. He had made sure of that, because he had not been able to make sure of Jean, and there are things a person does when they have failed to protect someone they love that they cannot explain except by doing them. She married Dale Vance at 22. He was a good man, careful and funny and deeply competent with his hands, the kind of man who does not say much when he is working, but whose silence in those moments is not distance. He had grown up in town, the son of a hardware store clerk, and he had come to the land the way some people come to a second language, by immersion and by paying close attention to people who had spoken it since birth. He learned to read, whether by the way the air smelled off the creek. He learned to tend the old apple tree at the property line the way Loretta's father tended it, which was not the way the extension service recommended, but the way the tree responded to, and it bloomed better for it. He never claimed to know the land the way Loretta knew it. He said once, near the end of his life, that the land had been patient with him, which was the most honest thing a man could say about that particular relationship. They had taken her family's house on that limestone foundation, which her parents had left to her when they moved into town in 1975, and they had raised Marcus and Patricia and Gwen in its rooms. Gwen had been the youngest and the one most like Loretta, inclined toward the ground and toward quiet, and Gwen now lived in Knoxville and called twice a week. Marcus had gone to the University of Kentucky on a partial scholarship and never come back to Harlan County except to visit, and the visits over the years had become shorter, and the frequency had become a function of holidays rather than desire. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided that the life he came from was something he had graduated from, and that decision had installed in him a particular kind of impatience with people who had not made the same choice. Dale died of stroke at 64 in the front bedroom, where Loretta had been born, and after that the house was hers in the complete way a house is yours when there is no longer any other person whose name could belong beside it. She had signed the power of attorney papers a year after Dale's death. The notary had driven out on a Tuesday in March when the mud was deep and the sky was low, and Loretta was tired in the specific way of a person who has been managing grief and practical matters simultaneously for 12 months. The papers were for the estate, Marcus said, for the bank accounts, the tax filings, the things that needed to be handled. He was the executor. He was trying to help. She believed both of those things to be true, and she signed without reading past the first page, and that was the plain fact of it. She did not understand what she had signed until the Lexington attorney drove out in October with the contract from the development group, and the timeline Marcus had agreed to. On the third night in the stone house, the temperature dropped below 20. She had enough wood beside the stove to keep it through the night if she fed it carefully, and she did, waking twice in the dark to add a stick, lying on her coat on the cot frame, and watching the seam of orange light at the stove door and thinking about her father. The days in the stone house had a structure she had not expected. She woke before light. She fed the stove. She boiled water in a tin pot her grandfather had left on the shelf. The enamel chipped at the rim, but the metal sound. She sat with her coffee and watched the hollow come up out of the dark, the cedar shapes first, then the creek line, then the limestone face of the spring shelf catching the early light before anything else. She had $63 in the deed and the key and whatever her father had meant when he said the floor holds more than the house. She was 68 years old, and she was living in a stone room on a cot frame, and she was not frightened in the way she had expected to be. The cold was real. The practical difficulties were real. Her back hurt from the cot by the fourth morning, and she remedied this by folding her coat under the thin cotton pad she had found in a box on the workbench, and the folded coat helped enough. She had grown up in a house without central heat until she was 16. She knew how to manage a fire, and she knew how to layer, and she knew that cold is a problem with solutions, which is true of most problems if you approach them as problems rather than as conditions you are required to suffer. What occupied her in those nights was not fear, but a kind of sustained reckoning with the past. She thought about the power of attorney she had signed in March, the way she had let the notary come to her on a tired day and sign where she was told. She had been managing alone for a year by then, Dale's death and the estate and the maintenance of the property and the loneliness that comes when a person you have lived beside for 45 years is simply no longer present to talk to, and she had been tired in a way that went down into her bones and sat there. She had trusted Marcus because Dale had trusted him, and because she had not had the strength in that particular March to be suspicious of her own son. She thought about the ways trust can be reasonable and still wrong. She thought about how a decision that costs you everything can look from the outside like a small thing, a folder, a Tuesday afternoon, a name signed in 3 places. She thought about her father pressing the key into her hand on the day she married and calling it the house key. And she thought about the 46 years she had carried it from coat to coat without ever asking herself why a house key was cut in that particular way, why it was small and brass and handmade, why it felt different from every other key she had ever carried. She had not asked because her father had given it to her, and her father's word had always been enough. She was not angry at herself for that. She had thought she might be, lying on the cot in the cold stone room, and she had discovered she was not. Her father had called it the house key, and it was the house key, in the truest sense, the key to what the house held beneath it, the key to what had been sealed away for her, and he had given it to her on the day she took on the house, and she had kept it for 46 years exactly as he had trusted her to, and it had not mattered that she did not know what lock it fit, because when the time came, she had known. Dillard Pruitt had told her the floor held more than the house. He had pressed the key into her hand. He had said she would know what to do when the time came. He had sealed whatever was under that floor in 1971 and gone on for 16 more years, until the heart the doctors had warned him about finally stopped, and he had never mentioned the cellar or the key or the floor a second time. She lay with that and turned it over. Not bitterness, not confusion exactly, more the feeling of a puzzle whose pieces have been in your pocket for 40 years, and you have only just understood they were pieces. She took the key out and held it in the lantern light. Brass, hand-cut, the bow worn smooth from years of handling. Not the profile of a door key. She could see that now, looking at it without the assumption she had always brought to it. Too small for a door. The bit was simple, but the cut was specific, made for one lock and not a standard blank. She thought about the trapdoor that had been painted over and then concreted over in 1973. She thought about the fact that she still had 11 days before the house transferred. She thought about Haverford's fee and whether $63 would matter in either direction. She got up and went to find a phone. The attorney's name was Cyrus Haverford. He was 60 years old and practiced property law out of Barberville, and Patricia had found his name through a colleague who said, "Use Haverford when the paperwork is already bad and the other side thinks they've won." He was a compact man who wore a red tie every day of his professional life and chewed a pen cap when he was thinking, and whose eyes, behind thick bifocals, moved across a document the way a good mechanic's hands move across an engine, quickly and with purpose. Loretta sat across from him on a Wednesday morning and told him everything. The key in the cellar and what her father had said. The power of attorney she had signed without reading it fully. The development contract and the 30-day window, and what she had found at the courthouse about the 4-acre parcel. She told it all in the order it happened, and she did not editorialize, and she did not ask for sympathy, and when she was done, she folded her hands on the edge of his desk and waited. Haverford chewed the pen cap for a while. He looked at the deed for the dollar parcel. He looked at the main property sale contract. He wrote things on a yellow pad. He said, "The closing is in 11 days. She said yes. He said, "You have no standing to stop the sale." She said she understood that. He said, "But a sealed substructure room that has not been disclosed in the condition report creates a potential issue with the seller's disclosure obligations. If there are personal effects of a prior owner in that room, the estate has an obligation to remove them before transfer of title." That's not a stretch. That's a reasonable reading of Kentucky property disclosure law. He took the pen cap out of his mouth. It would need to be filed with the court by Thursday, and you'd need someone who can attest, by affidavit, that the seller exists and was in your family's possession. She thought for a moment. The man who helped pour the addition foundation in 1961 is still alive. He's 84, and his name is Clem Mabry, and he lives off Route 25, and he laid that concrete himself with my father, and he knows every inch of that substructure. Haverford wrote the name down. Bring him Thursday morning. She drove out to Route 25 that afternoon. Clem Mabry was sitting on his front porch in a canvas coat, watching a red-tailed hawk work the field behind his barn. He looked at Loretta coming up the drive, and he said, before she had reached the steps, "I always wondered when somebody was going to ask me about that floor." He signed the affidavits on Thursday morning in his church clothes and shook her hand with both of his when Haverford walked him to his car. He said, "Your father put whatever he put down there for a reason, Loretta. Dillard never did a thing without a reason." He looked at the sky for a moment. "I'm glad it's you going down those steps." The judge signed the inspection order on a Friday. The development group's attorney objected on delay grounds. The judge, a woman named Reeves who had grown up in Bell County and had no patience for the specific variety of impatience that attaches itself to large money, read Clem Mabry's affidavit and looked at the condition report from the sale and said the inspection would proceed Monday. It would be done by 5 o'clock. If you're still with me as that door starts to open, do this story a kindness, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a good discovery story in the comments and let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. Monday morning was cold and bright with a frost on the gravel and the sky the clear hard blue that comes to eastern Kentucky in November when the weather has decided to be honest about what season it is. Loretta pulled up to the house at 8 o'clock and sat in her truck for a moment with the engine off and looked at it. The limestone foundation. The white clapboard siding gone gray at the corners where the paint had not been refreshed in 3 years. The addition her father had built off the back, solid and square, the roofline meeting the original at an angle that Dale had always said looked like the house was leaning in to listen. The chestnut shelves visible through the kitchen window, carrying nothing now but the light that came through the glass. She had not been inside since the day she left with her 2 bags and her coat and the leather pouch with the key in it. Haverford was already there, standing by his car in the red tie, his breath showing in the cold. The licensed inspector came a few minutes after, a quiet man named Breslin who had a pry bar and a small saw and an expression of professional neutrality that Loretta appreciated. The development group's representative, a man named Calhoun who worked in their project acquisitions office, stood by his own vehicle and spoke in a low voice on his phone for most of the time they were waiting. Marcus had been notified and had sent word through his attorney that he would not be present, but that the firm's representative would observe. That representative was a young woman named Hollis, good suits and a briefcase, who had drawn the assignment that morning and who, when she arrived, looked at the limestone foundation and the chestnut shelves in the kitchen window and said nothing at all. Calhoun produced the key for the new lock. They went inside. Loretta walked through the rooms, and she had told herself she would not slow down for this, that she would keep moving toward the utility room and work ahead, and she meant that and she held to it mostly, but there are things that the body does regardless of what the mind has decided, and her hand came up and touched the door frame in the back hall, where Dale had put the pencil marks, and she stood there for a moment with her fingers on those faint lines, the names and the years in his hand, and then she moved on. The utility room was off the back hall past the water heater. The floor was original linoleum from the 1973 renovation, the green and cream pattern that had been fashionable for about 4 years and then became just the floor. She had mopped that floor several thousand times. She knew every seam in it. There was a seam running in a rectangle about 30 inches by 24 that she had always attributed to a crack in the subfloor. Standing over it now, with Breslin beside her, and Haverford behind her and Hollis on the threshold taking notes, she saw that it was too regular for a settling crack. The corners were right angles. It was a rectangle because something rectangular lay beneath it. Breslin looked at her. She nodded. He cut along the seam. The linoleum lifted cleanly. Beneath it, a 2-inch pour of concrete, gray and dry, set in panels in the way of someone who had poured in sections and had not been in a hurry. Breslin worked the pry bar into the panel seams. The concrete came up in sections, crumbling at the edges, and beneath it the original pine subfloor, the boards wide and dark with age, the grain running the length of the house. And in the subfloor, not hidden at all to someone who was looking, the outline of a trapdoor. The hinges were still set. The latch was recessed into a notch that the concrete pour had filled, but not deeply, and when Breslin cleared the concrete dust with the flat of his hand, the brass latch sat there plain as a fact that has been waiting for someone to stop walking past it. Loretta took the key from her coat pocket. She crouched over the latch. She brushed the last of the grit away. The latch was a small brass fixture, the kind a locksmith made to order in the era before hardware stores stocked everything. Old work. Careful work. The same vintage as the key in her hand, the same era as her father's hands. She fitted the key into the slot. It turned. The trapdoor opened downward on its hinges, and the sound it made was not the shriek of seized metal, but a low, steady complaint, the sound of something that was made to move and has been held still for too long and is now being asked to do its job again. The smell that came up from the opening was cold stone and cedar and the dry, sealed air of a room that had been breathing only itself for 50 years. Breslin shone his light down the steps. Stone steps, 8 of them, cut from the same limestone as the foundation, worn at the center where feet had gone down them for decades before the door was sealed. The space below was roughly 12 feet square. The walls were dry fieldstone. A single timber spanned the ceiling. The dirt floor was packed clay, hard and cold. Loretta went down first. The beam of Breslin's flashlight swept the room. Along the far wall, on a low stone ledge her grandfather had built from the same flat stones as the walls, for objects sat in the order someone had placed them with care. A metal lockbox, 18 inches long and a foot deep, the kind made to hold documents flat, painted dark green and now showing the brown edge of age. Beside it, a wooden crate about 2 feet across with a fitted lid nailed shut. Beside that, 2 glass jars sealed with brown wax around the lid seam, the kind of seal her mother had used on canning before the snap lids became common. And leaning against the wall, beside the ledge, upright and tied at the top with a leather cord, a leather document tube of the kind used to carry rolled papers or surveys. Everything was dry. Everything was exactly as it had been placed. Loretta stood in the middle of the room and breathed. She let the silence settle. The beam of the light was steady. Above her, she could hear Calhoun's voice and Hollis moving on the boards and somewhere outside a truck on the county road. Down here, it was cold and still, and the stone walls held everything that had been held in them since her father sealed the door in 1971, 2 years before the plumber poured the concrete, 2 years before the linoleum covered the seam, 37 years before Dale died, and the estate became complicated and the development group came to look at the land. She crossed the room to the lockbox. The latch was a simple press catch, not locked. It opened on a hinge, and inside, laid flat on a folded piece of wool flannel that had kept it dry and clean, were papers. Documents folded and stacked, and on top of them all a handwritten letter on plain paper. The date at the top in her father's hand, April of 1971. She picked it up. She read it in the light Breslin held steady over her shoulder. She read it once, and she read it again. Her father had written, "Loretta, if you're reading this, it means you kept the key and you knew where to use it, which means I taught you right even when I wasn't trying to. The land under this house has a history you don't know and a value that has been hidden not from you, but for you. I want to explain it before you open the rest of what's in this room. Read the land survey first, then the mineral survey attached to it, then the hydrological report from the university man. Then you will understand why I did what I did in 1968 and why I am down here on a Tuesday in April putting this in the ground for you. I love you, Stell. Your father." She opened the papers. The first was a land survey, hand-drawn and then reproduced in ink, dated 1958. It described the 4-acre parcel in the South Hollow, the one she had bought for $1 the week before, and it included a subsurface notation she had never seen on any deed or document she had handled in her life. Below the survey was a second document, this one typed on paper with a university letterhead, dated 1966. Her father had commissioned a hydrogeological assessment of the hollow from a professor at the University of Kentucky's geology department, a man whose name she did not recognize. The assessment was careful and specific. The hollow sat above a faulted limestone shelf through which a natural spring discharged at the creek's base. That spring was not simply a surface spring. It was the primary surface expression of an underground aquifer system that the assessment had measured and mapped. The aquifer had a sustainable yield, the report estimated, of approximately 80 gallons per minute under normal conditions and significantly more in wet years. It fed the watershed of 3 adjacent hollow systems. The report described it as a resource of regional hydrological significance. In 1966, her father had filed the water rights with the county clerk. The filing was in the stack, stamped and dated, the county clerk's seal pressed into the paper. the language of the registration precise and complete. The 4-acre parcel Loretta had bought for $1 included the surface rights, the mineral rights, and the senior registered water rights to that aquifer system. Senior water rights, under Kentucky law, meant that in a competition for water access, her rights came before any subsequently registered claim. She stood there with the papers in her hands, and she heard her own breathing in the cold room, and she heard Breslin shifting his weight on the stone steps behind her. Below the documents was the wooden crate. She worked the lid up with the pry bar Breslin handed her. Inside, packed in dry straw, sat 12 glass bottles sealed with wax, each one holding clear water. Her father's handwriting on a note tucked in the straw said, "From the spring, 1966. For the day you need proof of what it was." The glass jars held seeds, Cherokee purple tomato seeds she recognized from her mother's garden, and a variety of October bean her grandmother had grown, dried and sealed, and perfectly viable if you knew what to do with them. The leather tube held the original survey plat rolled tight, and a second document, a registered deed for a right-of-way easement across the main parcel, signed and stamped and filed. The 4-acre hollow and its spring had a legal recorded right of access across the larger property that no subsequent buyer could extinguish without her agreement as the title holder of the south parcel. The development group intended to build a residential subdivision on the main parcel and the surrounding land they had optioned. That subdivision would require water infrastructure and utility service. The county water line ran 2 miles east and was not being extended into this hollow by any filed plan. The aquifer beneath the 4 acres Loretta Vance had bought for $1 was, according to the 1966 university report, the only viable water source for a development of the size the group had proposed. Without a water rights agreement with the owner of that parcel, the development could not be built. The room was very quiet. She stood with the papers in her hands and looked at the stone wall her grandfather had laid in 1921, and she thought about her father kneeling on this dirt floor in April of 1971 with a lantern of his own, putting these things in their order on that ledge, setting the lid on the crate, rolling the survey into the leather tube, folding the letter last, and laying it on top. She thought about what it had taken to do that. Not just the legal work, which had required a lawyer and time and money her father had not had in abundance. Not just the physical work of building the ledge and sealing the door and pouring the concrete 2 years later when the renovation gave him the cover to do it without explaining himself. All of that required effort and planning. What it had required beyond that was the patience and the faith in her specifically, in Loretta, not in her brothers who had moved away, and not in any institution or system, but in his youngest daughter, the one who had grown up beside him in the hollow and learned the work without studying it, the one he had pressed the key into and called it the house key and trusted to figure it out when the time came. He had never put this in writing for her before his death in 1987. He had trusted the key and the floor and the letter and the particular persistence of the daughter he had raised to hold a thing carefully and not throw it away. She put the papers back in a lockbox. She picked up the leather tube. She went up the steps. Haverford was standing in the kitchen by the chestnut shells with his coat on and his pen cap in his hand. When she came through the utility room door with the lockbox under her arm and the tube in her hand, he looked at her face and did not say anything for a moment. Hollis had come in from the threshold. Calhoun was in the back hall on his phone. She told Haverford what was in the box. She told it plainly, in order, the survey and the hydrological report and the water rights filing and the right-of-way easement. She set the lockbox on the chestnut shelf and opened it and laid the papers out, and he read them standing at the kitchen counter with his glasses on and his pen cap going between his teeth and his hand. He read the hydrological report all the way through. He read the water rights filing twice. He set it down carefully on the counter and stood with his hand on it for a moment. Then he said, "Your father filed these water rights in 1966, and they are senior to any claim the development group has on this property or its adjacent parcels." He picked up the right-of-way document, and this easement gives the south parcel access across the main property. He set it down, which means the south parcel, which you own, has both the water rights and the legal access to exercise them. He looked at her. "You bought that parcel for $1. She said she knew. He said, the development group's project financing is contingent on this site being viable for subdivision. A subdivision of the scale they've proposed requires a water source. The county water line is not available. Their own filings confirm they intended to use well access from the hollow. He paused. They cannot build without an agreement with you. Hollis was writing in her notebook. Calhoun had gone outside. They could hear his voice through the wall, the register of a man whose mourning has turned into something considerably larger than he was sent to manage. Loretta put her father's letter back in the lockbox and closed the lid and rested her hand on it for a moment. Above her, the chestnut shelves ran the length of the kitchen wall, 60 years of solid work, still holding. Outside the window, above the sink, the hollow ran south toward the cedar and the creek and the spring her grandfather had drunk from and her father had mapped and her father's father had simply lived beside, the water coming up through the limestone the way it had always come, cold and clean and older than any document that described it. She had known what to do when the time came. She had been frightened and cold and wrong about some things and right about others, and she had done what her father had trusted her to do. She had kept the key. The closing was postponed the following morning. The development group's lead attorney, a man named Prather who wore cufflinks and spoke in the manner of someone accustomed to concluding negotiations rather than revising them, came down from Lexington for the first meeting. He made an initial offer on the south parcel. Haverford declined it without visible effort. Prather revised. Haverford declined again. After the third session, the development group brought an independent hydrologist who reviewed the 1966 report and tested the sealed water samples Loretta's father had left in the crate and confirmed both the aquifer's capacity and the validity of the water rights registration. After the hydrologist's report came back, Prather's manner acquired a different quality. The pleasantness was still there. The certainty underneath it was not. The final agreement took 3 weeks to structure. Haverford managed the negotiations with the economy of a man who understands that the less he says in a room where the other side is recalculating, the better his position becomes. Loretta attended 2 of the 4 sessions and sat with her hands folded on the table and answered questions when they were put to her and did not fill silence with reassurance, which was something she had learned from her father, who had believed that a person who speaks to fill a room usually fills it with things that cost them. Prather brought in a second attorney for the 3rd session, a woman named Garvey who specialized in water law and who spent 40 minutes going through the 1966 registration and the county records looking for a technical deficiency in the filing. She did not find one. Loretta's father had filed correctly in every particular. The registration was senior. The language was clean. Dillard Pruitt had not been a lawyer, but he had been a careful man, and the document he had filed in 1966 was the document of a careful man who had also spoken with a lawyer before he drove to the courthouse, a fact Haverford discovered in the county records, where the attorney who had advised her father on the water rights registration had also noted the consultation in his own files that were now held by his son, who practiced family law in Barberville and who provided copies on request. Garvey said to Prather, at the end of her review, something Loretta was not meant to hear through the conference room door, but heard plainly, the registration is solid. The easement is solid. We can't build the project without the water, and we can't get the water without her. Prather made a final offer on the 4th session. It was a permanent water rights access easement, structured as a use agreement with a term of 50 years, renewable at Loretta's election, in exchange for a lump sum payment and a buyback option on the main house at a price the development group would accept given their revised project economics. Haverford reviewed the numbers with Loretta that evening at his office with the yellow pad and the coffee and the red tie and his particular competence. She said, "What did my father's registration actually protect? The whole aquifer?" He said, "The senior water rights to the primary aquifer surface expression on your 4 acres, which is, per the hydrological assessment, the only viable large volume source for this hollow system. They can drill elsewhere. They can engineer around it. But it adds millions to their infrastructure costs and likely makes the project too expensive to be worth pursuing at the scale they've modeled." She said, So they need what my father registered. He said, they need it badly enough that this offer represents a significant concession on their part. She looked at the numbers for a while. She thought about her father going down those steps in April of 1971 with a lantern and no certainty that any of this would ever be needed and doing it anyway. 52 years between the sealing of that door and the morning she opened it. She thought about what faith that took. Not religious faith, though her father had had that too, but the specific faith of a person who builds something carefully and then steps back and trusts the building. She accepted the offer the following morning. Loretta granted a permanent water rights access easement for the development's use at a rate that reflected what the resource was actually worth, which was considerably more than the development group had modeled for in their acquisition costs. The payment from that easement allowed Loretta to purchase the main house back from the development group at a price that reflected their revised project economics, which is to say, at a price that was not $312,000. The deed transferred on a Tuesday morning at the courthouse in Corbin. Haverford stood beside her at the table while the papers were signed. When the clerk stamped the deed and handed it over, Loretta held it for a moment before she put it in the folder. The grantee line read, Loretta Ruth Vance. Same name it had held before. Same house it had always been. She put the deed in the folder and the folder in her bag and thanked the clerk and walked out into the January light. Haverford walked with her to the parking lot. He shook her hand and held it a moment. He said, Your father was a very thorough man. She said, He was the most thorough person I have ever known. He nodded and let her hand go and walked to his car. Marcus called on a Wednesday evening from Denver, 3 days before the closing. She let it ring twice and then answered. He had spoken with Haverford's office. He understood what had happened. He was quiet in a way she had not heard from him in several years. He said he was glad the house would stay in the family. He said he was sorry about the power of attorney, about the development contract, about the timeline he had agreed to without sitting down with her first and asking her what she wanted. She listened to all of it. She said, Your grandfather buried that down there in 1971 for exactly this kind of day. I think he trusted me to find it. She paused. I like it if you came home sometime and saw the place. Another pause. He said he would come in the spring. She got the keys on a Tuesday in January. She stood at the front door and put the new key in the lock and opened it and stood on the threshold for a moment with the cold air moving through from the back of the house where a window had been left cracked. She went inside slowly, through the front rooms and down the hall and past the door frame where Dale's pencil marks were still there, the names and the years small and faint and permanent. She went to the utility room and stood over the open trapdoor and looked down the stone steps to the floor below, where her father's patients had held for 50 years. She went down and got the wooden crate with the water bottles and carried it up. She set one bottle on the windowsill above the sink, the one that sat 6 inches too high, and the winter light hit the water inside and put a small bright shape on the wall opposite, a moving thing, alive the way water is alive. In February, she put the cellar back in order. New hinges on the trapdoor, a proper latch and hardware, a light on a switch run down the wall. She swept the stone floor herself and whitewashed the stone walls and put up a proper shelf along one side for the mason jars and the bottles her father had left and the document tube with the surveys in it. She put the lockbox on the shelf in the kitchen above the chestnut shelving, beside Dale's pocket knife and a photograph of her parents taken in the summer of 1952 in the field behind the house. Her mother laughing at something off to the left, and her father looking at her mother with the expression of a man who is watching something he cannot believe his luck at. Clem Mabry came on the first warm Saturday in March. He was 84 and moved with the carefulness of a man who has learned to be deliberate about where he puts his feet, but his eyes were sharp and his hands were steady. He walked through the house slowly and ran his hand along the chestnut shelving in the kitchen and stood at the utility room door and looked down the stone steps for a long moment. He said, I poured that concrete in 1973. Never did ask Dillard what was under it. He didn't offer and I didn't push. He shook his head a little. I should have known he was burying something that mattered. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and he talked about her father the way very old men talk about people they worked beside for decades, in short, specific memories rather than summaries. The spring he had helped her father trench the drainage line along the South Hollow. The winter her father had driven to Lexington to have the water tested at the university, told nobody why, came back, and said only that the water was good. The year he had watched Dillard filing documents at the courthouse and asked what he was registering, and Dillard had said, something for Loretta, and Clee had let it go at that. Patricia came down from Ohio in March, the first visit since everything had resolved. She walked through the house and stood in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything, her hand on the chestnut shelf. Loretta made supper, and they sat at the table where the family had eaten 10,000 meals, and they talked until late. Patricia said she had called Marcus. He had told her he intended to come in April. She looked at Loretta and said, "You know, I would have come sooner if you'd asked." Loretta said she knew. Patricia said, "Why didn't you ask?" Loretta thought about it. She said, "Because your grandfather didn't ask anyone either. He just did the thing that needed doing and trusted that it would be enough." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Was it enough?" Loretta said yes. She meant it. In April, Marcus came. He drove down from Denver and arrived on a Thursday evening and stood on the front porch for a long moment before he knocked, though the door was open and she had been watching his car come up the lane. She let him stand there. He had that coming. When he came inside, she made him coffee, and they sat in the kitchen with the chestnut shelves behind her, and she showed him the lockbox and the papers and the letter in her father's handwriting. He read the letter twice. He set it down carefully on the kitchen table. He did not say he was sorry again. He had already said that, and she had already received it, and they both understood the ledger had been closed on that business. He said, "Grandpa was something." She said, "He was the most thorough person I have ever known." Marcus nodded. He stayed 4 days. He helped her clear brush from the south lane and repair the gate at the hollow, and he stacked wood without being asked, and they worked mostly in the quiet that two people share when they are rebuilding something after having let it run down, carefully and without making it into more than it was. She walked Clee down to the hollow that afternoon, the two of them moving slowly along the south lane in the March mud, and she showed him the stone house she had slept in through November and December, the stove she had kept through those nights, the creek below, the spring coming out of the limestone shelf exactly where the 1966 report had mapped it, the water cold and clear in the early light. She cupped some in her hand and drank it. Clee stood beside her and looked at the creek running down the hollow and said, he loved this place. Not the house, the ground itself. He looked at her. He knew you did too. She was 68 years old. She had a house and 4 acres and a spring and a cellar full of what her father had sealed for her, and she had nowhere else in the world she needed to be. She had the key in her coat pocket, still there, still transferred from coat to coat the way she had always done. She did not need it for any lock anymore. She kept it anyway. The spring ran cold and steady all through March and into April. She walked down to it in the mornings before the day started, standing at the limestone shelf where the water came up, listening to the creek, watching the cedar come back green along the south bank. On a morning in late April, she stood there long enough to see a pair of kingfishers working the water below the spring, and she thought about her father on his Tuesday in 1971, going down those stone steps with a lantern, laying his faith in the ground with the care of a man who understood that patience is not passive. Patience is a specific kind of work, the choice to build something that will outlast your own knowledge of whether it worked. She went back up the hollow to the house. The chestnut shelves in the kitchen, the bottle of spring water on the windowsill, the light moving through it, the old documents in the lockbox on the shelf, her father's handwriting on the letter folded on top, the trapdoor in the utility room floor, the hinges oiled now, the steps swept clean, the stone room below dry and lit and hers. She stood at the kitchen sink and put her hands in the water and washed them and looked out the window at the hollow, at the cedar going green, at the thin, bright line of the creek far below. Keep going. She did not know where the thought came from. It felt like her father's voice, though her father had never said those particular words to her that she could remember. It felt like her own voice, too, which may have been the same thing. She was not finished. She had the ground under her feet and the key in her pocket and the work of the morning still ahead, and she was not finished. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. We tell stories about ordinary people who were overlooked, discarded, and counted out until they found what was theirs all along. See you in the next one.